Usually when we talk about how the world is organized, there's this expectation of neatness, right?
Oh, absolutely. We like things to be tidy.
Right, like architecture. You look at a world map and you see those really bold, solid lines separating all the pastel colors, and you just assume, well, there it is.
That's the container.
Exactly, the container. Like that is just how human beings work. We are in this box, they're in that box.
And it feels incredibly settled, doesn't it? I mean, we grew up looking at globes in classrooms.
Oh yeah, the ones you spin around.
Yeah. And we just internalize those black lines as if they're, I don't know, physical walls etched right into the earth.
Completely. And I mean, it's comforting. We really like things to be clearly defined. I actually like to think of it as the bento box view of the world.
A bento box. I like that.
Yeah, you have a container, and inside that container are all these neat little compartments. You've got your rice in one section, your salmon in another, your pickles over here.
Everything has its specific place.
Right. France is one compartment, Japan is another, Brazil is another, and nothing touches. The flavors don't mix. You govern the rice. You tax the salmon.
That bento box analogy is essentially what sociologists call methodological nationalism.
Methodological nationalism.
Yeah, it's basically the assumption that the nation state is the natural absolute container of a society. But the thing is, when you step into the actual lived reality of human movement or, economies and culture, it breaks down.
Gets messy.
Extremely messy. Suddenly that pristine map starts looking less like a reflection of reality and more like, well, a hopeful fiction. The flavors are bleeding into each other everywhere, the rices and the pickles.
Which just is such a wild paradigm shift for us. Because you look at the map, you see the bold lines, but what if the map is lying to you?
Or at least telling a very, very incomplete story.
Right. So today, in this deep dive, our mission is basically tearing down those borders, at least conceptually speaking. We are unpacking a massive essay on a framework called Transnational Studies.
And the core argument here, for you listening, is that people, ideas, money, diseases, goods, they don't stop at borders.
They just don't.
No, and importantly, they never have. If you ignore these cross-border flows, you are looking at a fundamentally distorted picture of reality.
And it's such an ingrained illusion to overcome.
Bro, deeply ingrained. I mean, since the mid-1600s, specifically the Peace of Westphalia and 1648 European powers, basically laid the groundwork for this system.
The system where a government has exclusive sovereignty over a defined territory.
Exactly. It drew the lines. Populations were suddenly sorted into citizens and foreigners. Economies were regulated right at that physical frontier.
Even their own personal identities, right? Like our passports.
Yes, passports, our legal rights, they're all built entirely on this specific historical cartography. We invented a way of seeing the world, and then we completely forgot we invented it.
That's nuts. And it wasn't just politicians who bought into this, right?
Yeah.
Like academia did too.
Oh, absolutely. The traditional social sciences, sociology, economics, political science, history, they largely accepted this architecture as natural for a very long time.
So they studied societies as if each one was a self-contained unit with its own internal logic.
Right, which becomes a huge problem because the flows that constitute modern life are inherently cross-border.
So if we want to understand how you, the listener, conceive of your own identity, your obligations, or even the economy you participate in every single day, we have to look past the container.
We have to. Transnational Studies demands that we examine the world as it actually operates on the ground, not as the map suggests it should.
Okay, so to really understand this, I feel like we have to look backward first.
Yeah.
Because we tend to think of this hyper-connected, borderless reality as a totally modern phenomenon.
Yeah, we think of the internet, jumbo jets, fiber optic cables.
Exactly. But humans have been ignoring borders for centuries. So why did we suddenly need a new vocabulary for something we've been doing since we could literally walk?
That deep history is exactly where we have to start, because long before anyone coined the word transnational, the world was already organized by these massive overlapping flows.
Like the Silk Road, which the source text brings up right away.
Yes, consider the Silk Road. It wasn't just a physical dirt path for trading silk, it was this incredibly complex network.
Connecting what? China, Central Asia, Persia, Rome?
Right, across thousands of miles. That was a profound flow of technology, of philosophical ideas, of religions, and Yes, devastating plagues.
And it functioned entirely without modern passports or bounded nation-states.
Completely. Or think about the spread of Islam from the 7th century onward. It created a vast religious, intellectual, and economic civilization.
That completely transcended the political boundaries of the time.
Exactly. An artisan in Spain and a merchant in Baghdad were part of the same massive flow.
The source also mentions the medieval Catholic Church, which is fascinating.
We often forget that the church was essentially a transnational institutional structure. It competed directly with secular kings and local rulers for authority over populations across the entirety of Europe.
Because they collected taxes, right? The tithes.
Yes, tithes, and they had their own courts, and they communicated in a shared language, Latin, across dozens of different vernacular territories.
So to a medieval peasant, the local lord was one authority, but the transnational church was another, totally separate one.
And its power flowed right over the kingdom's borders.
Okay, so the connections have always been there. So what changed? If we've always been moving and connecting like this, why did the whole framework of how we study the world need to shift so dramatically in the late 20th century?
Well, the shift happened because of a massive paradox that emerged right after the Second World War.
A paradox? What do you mean?
So on one side of the ledger, you have the world defining national borders more strictly than ever before in human history.
Ah, right. The creation of the United Nations.
Exactly, which is literally built on the premise of sovereign, independent states. Plus, you have decolonization, creating dozens of new nations, drawing hard lines on maps.
And the Cold War, dividing the world into these rigid, militarized ideological blocks.
Right. It was the absolute peak of the bento box, every single nation fiercely guarding its sovereignty.
But then, what's on the other side of the ledger?
On the other side, simultaneously, the architects of the post-war world were creating massive international institutions that hopelessly tangled those exact same nations together.
Like the Bretton Woods system.
Yes. That created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Suddenly, the domestic economic policy of a newly independent nation in Africa was intimately, structurally tied to decisions made by bankers in Washington and London.
And multinational corporations start exploding in size and influence.
Right. So the formal equality of sovereign states was just a facade. It covered up a deeply interconnected and often highly unequal reality.
The reality was basically outgrowing the vocabulary. And the political scientists noticed this first, right, in the 1970s.
They did. You had scholars in 1971, like Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, challenging the dominant theory of realism.
And realism basically said, look, the only actors that matter on the global stage are states with armies. It's the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and everything else is just noise.
Exactly. But the pushback was to point out the glaring blind spots of that view. Like, how do you explain the global influence of a massive oil conglomerate?
Or the impact of international human rights NGOs.
Or transnational revolutionary movements. I mean, none of these are states, but they were fundamentally shaping global affairs. They were acting above, below, and straight through the borders.
But to get to the core of what we now call transnational studies, we really have to look at what happened in the 1990s, right?
Yes, that's when the focus shifted away from these giant corporations and institutions down to actual human beings. Anthropologists started looking at migrants.
Specifically, I think the text mentions Linda Basch, Glick Schiller, and Cristina Szanton Blanc. They wrote a book in 1994 called Nations Unbound.
That's the one. They studied Caribbean migrants living in the United States, and what they noticed completely broke all the old rules of immigration.
Because the old rules were basically the assimilationist paradigm.
Right.
The classic Ellis Island story.
Yes. The idea was always, you leave your old country, you move to the new country, you gradually shed your old ties, you learn the new language.
And over a generation or two, you were fully incorporated into the receiving society. You basically move from one compartment of the bento box entirely into another.
Exactly. But the researchers in the 90s realized that story was completely obsolete. These Caribbean migrants weren't just cutting ties and moving on.
Wait, so how is this different from standard immigration? Doesn't someone just move, assimilate, and become part of the new bento box eventually?
No, that's the thing. They were actively building lives embedded in two or more national societies simultaneously.
Simultaneously. Okay. So what do they call this?
They coined a term for this specific human experience. Transmigrants.
Transmigrants. Not just migrants.
Right. A transmigrant isn't just someone who moved. A transmigrant is someone who maintains ongoing, dense social, economic, and political relations across borders.
And what made this entirely different from, say, the migration of the 1800s was the underlying infrastructure.
The technology, absolutely. If you got on a boat from Italy to New York in 1900, you might literally never see your mother again. A letter took weeks.
But in the late 20th century, you have cheap international flights, you have instant wire transfers, you have long-distance calling, and eventually, the internet.
Technology allowed human agency to stretch across geography. You could work a construction job in New York during the day, wire money to build a house in your home village in the Dominican Republic in the afternoon.
And then call your family to discuss local town politics in the evening. You are actively living in two places at once.
Exactly. Which brings up a really important distinction for us to clarify here. Someone hearing this might say, oh, I know what you're talking about. You're just describing globalization.
But globalization and transnationalism are not the same thing, right?
Right.
The source is very clear on that.
They're very distinct frameworks. Globalization is generally used to describe macro structural processes. It's abstract.
So when we talk about globalization, we're talking about things like the integration of global financial markets or the spread of internet architecture.
Or the supply chains of multinational tech giants, yeah. It operates at a systemic altitude. It often feels like something happening to people, like this unstoppable structural force.
So globalization is the abstract architecture. But transnationalism is about the human beings living inside that architecture.
Exactly. It's about agency. It's the specific cultural identities, the family networks, and the daily survival strategies that emerge when people figure out how to navigate across those borders.
I see. If globalization is the global financial market, transnationalism is the migrant worker figuring out how to use that market to send $50 home to pay for sister's medical bill.
It brings the focus right down to the human scale. But, once scholars realized that people were actively living across these lines, they faced a massive problem.
How to study it.
Right. If sociology and economics were built entirely to study isolated containers, what new lenses do we actually need to make sense of a completely borderless, messy world?
They needed entirely new theoretical toolkits. And it's fascinating because transnational studies doesn't just one unified theory. It's more like a conversation between different disciplines trying to tackle the same mess.
Let's look at the first major lens they developed, the structural approach.
Yeah.
This takes us to world systems theory.
Emanuel Wallerstein's theory from the 1970s, right?
Yes. Heavily driven by sociologists and economic historians who argued that looking at individual national economies was basically a fool's errand.
Because you can't understand the wealth of France or the poverty of a West African nation by just looking at their internal policies.
Exactly. Instead, they argued, the entire globe is organized into a single capitalist world system, and this system is fundamentally hierarchical.
It's divided into zones. You have the core of wealthy industrialized nations, and you have a periphery of poorer developing nations.
And, well, a semi-periphery in between. But the critical mechanism of this theory is extraction.
Extraction. Like mining resources.
Resources and labor. The entire global system functions by extracting cheap labor and raw materials from the periphery, funneling them to the core, and allowing the core to accumulate massive wealth.
So the core actually relies on the underdevelopment of the periphery to maintain its status.
It requires it. So how does this reframe our understanding of a person crossing a border?
Right. If I'm a migrant leaving a struggling rural economy in the periphery to find work in a wealthy core city, the traditional view might say, oh, that's an individual economic choice. They are just seeking a better life.
But world systems theory strips away that hyper-individualistic narrative.
Right.
It says your migration is not just a random personal choice.
It's structured.
Highly structured, dictated by historical inequalities. The core systematically underdeveloped your home region over centuries, perhaps through colonialism, perhaps through unfair trade agreements.
Creating the exact economic conditions that now force you to move.
Exactly. The flow of human beings follows the historical flow of extracted wealth.
Yeah.
It is not a level playing field at all.
Wow. It's a heavy realization. It shifts the burden of why people move completely from individual desire to, structural gravity.
It does. So that's the structural lens, but there's also a spatial lens.
Right. Like, where is all this transnational activity actually happening on the ground?
Yeah.
Because it's obviously not happening everywhere equally.
Which brings us to a really compelling concept from Saskia Sassen in 1991, global cities.
Global cities. I love this concept.
The realization here was that globalization doesn't just blanket the Earth evenly, right? It touches down and concentrates in very specific urban nodes.
Think of New York, London, Tokyo.
Yes. As manufacturing moved across the globe, these specific cities transitioned into something else entirely. They became the command and control centers for the global economy.
They concentrate the high-level financial, legal, accounting, and managerial functions that coordinate all this transnational activity.
Yeah, and you called them earlier the operating systems of the global economy. I think that's perfect.
Yeah, because an investment banker in London honestly has more in common culturally, economically, and socially with a hedge fund manager in Singapore than they do with a farmer in the north of their own country in England.
The cities are networked together on a totally different frequency, just bypassing their own national hinterlands completely.
But Szanton points out a really crucial detail about what happens inside these cities.
Right. The extreme localized polarization. You don't just have an entire city of elite transnational managers.
Right. Those elites require a massive physical social infrastructure just to maintain their highly demanding lifestyles, to keep the glass towers functioning.
Someone has to clean the corner office at 3 a.m. Someone has to make the artisanal coffee, drive the ride shares, deliver the takeout.
And care for the children of the executives.
Exactly. And that essential labor force is heavily comprised of low-wage, often undocumented, transmigrant workers.
So within just a few square miles of a global city, you have the high-end transnational finance professional living side by side with the low-wage transnational laborer.
The extreme inequalities of the world system aren't just between distant countries. They are lived out block by block, subway stop by subway stop within these urban nodes.
The city itself becomes a border zone.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've mapped the structure and we've mapped the space. Now let's shift to the cultural and identity lens.
Diasporas.
Studies, right. Because when people move through this system, what happens to who they are?
Well, historically, the term diaspora was used almost exclusively to describe the Jewish experience of dispersal from a homeland.
A scattering characterized by trauma, exile, and this persistent intergenerational longing to return to an original origin point.
Yes, but modern scholars have vastly expanded the concept to understand other dispersed populations, the African diaspora, the Armenian, Chinese, Irish, South Asian, and more.
And when you apply this lens, it totally shatters the idea that cultural identity is this stable, unchanging object that you just, pack in your suitcase.
The traditional view is that you are born with a cultural identity, it's continuous, and if you move, you just try to preserve it in a sort of amber.
But theorists in this field, like Stuart Hall, they argue for something called hybridity.
Hybridity is the understanding that identity is never a finished product. It is a constant process of synthesis.
So in diaspora, you aren't simply preserving an ancient homeland culture, because the homeland itself is changing too.
And you are not fully assimilating into the new host culture either. You are creatively blending influences. You are forging something entirely new out of the collision of cultures.
There is a specific historical metaphor the source discusses that captures this perfectly. It comes from Paul Gilroy's 1993 book, The Black Atlantic.
Ah, yes. It's an analysis of the cultures of people of African descent in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe.
And his argument is that you cannot understand these cultures through the lens of any single nation. They aren't purely African, not purely American or British. They constitute a shared Black Atlantic culture.
And the central metaphor Gilroy uses for how this culture was forged is the ship.
The ship. It's such a powerful, devastating metaphor.
It is analytically profound. In the context of the transatlantic slave trade, the ship is the ultimate vehicle of terror, forced movement, and unimaginable trauma.
But paradoxically, it also became the site of forced cultural synthesis.
Yes. Diverse African populations speaking completely different languages and holding different beliefs were violently thrust together in the hold of a ship.
So to survive, to communicate, to resist, they had to begin forging a new shared culture while in transit.
The culture wasn't bound by the soil of a nation. It was born on the ocean between them. The movement itself, the space between the borders, was the crucible of identity.
Wow. And what's fascinating is that this diaspora experience doesn't just stay contained within the migrant community. There's a concept from Aftar Bra called diaspora space.
Right. It argues that the moment a society receives a diaspora, the entire society changes.
Even the dominant native-born population who has lived there for 10 generations is suddenly implicated in diaspora relations.
Because Their world is altered. The food they eat, the music they hear, the neighborhood dynamics, the political debates, everything is fundamentally implicated by the transnational flows happening around them.
Nobody is insulated. You
Yeah.
can't just seal off the local from the global.
Which brings a very critical historical edge to the conversation. We can't talk about all this mixing and movement without talking about power.
And that is where post-colonial theory steps in as a really vital lens.
Because if we aren't careful, we can start painting this picture of a borderless world as something inherently progressive, cosmopolitan, and free.
Yeah, we imagine everyone holding hands across the equator, just swapping recipes. Post-colonial scholars look at that and say, hold on, let's look at the history.
Scholars like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Homi Bhabha, who talks about the third space, they remind us that colonialism was itself a vast, brutal transnational system.
It was the original globalization.
It structured the world's economy, its borders, and its racial hierarchies for centuries. And the legacies of that system still heavily dictate the patterns of movement today.
So transnational flows carry the ghosts of empire. You cannot understand why a specific flow of migration is happening today without understanding which empire drew the borders and extracted the wealth 100 years ago.
And knowing this creates an intense ethical demand. This brings in cosmopolitanism. Philosophers like Martha Nussbaum and Kwame Anthony Appiah look at this deeply connected, highly unequal world and ask, what are our moral obligations?
They advocate for a moral obligation to all human beings, not just citizens of your own country. And Ulrich Beck even advocates for methodological cosmopolitanism, basically abandoning the nation-state as the natural container of society altogether.
The core question is, if the economy is transnational, if the environmental impacts are transnational, why should our moral concerns stop at a line drawn on a map by an army 3 centuries ago?
It challenges the whole assumption that we only owe solidarity to people who carry the same passport.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have these incredibly complex moving theories. We're talking about global financial extraction, hybridized identities forming on oceans, and the lingering ghosts of colonialism. But let's get practical for a second.
Methodologically speaking.
Yeah. If you are a sociologist, an anthropologist, or a historian whose actual job is to research this, how do you study a moving target?
It creates methodological madness. I mean, the traditional tools of social science were built to study bounded units.
Right. You want to understand a community. You go to a specific town, you live there for 2 years, you survey the people, you map the streets, you treat it like a terrarium.
But if the community is physically split between a village in Mexico, a meatpacking plant in Iowa, and a construction site in Texas, the terrarium is totally shattered.
So what do?
Well, it led to a massive breakthrough in 1995 by George Marcus called multi-sited ethnography.
Multi-sited ethnography, meaning you go to multiple sites.
The argument was simple but radical. To study a transnational phenomenon, the researcher cannot stay put. You have to physically and conceptually follow the subject.
You follow the people as they migrate. You follow the agricultural commodity from the farm to the supermarket. You follow the metaphor, the story, the flow of money.
You construct your field of study across disconnected geographic spaces.
I get the logic, I really do, but I have to push back a little. Doesn't a researcher lose something essential if they are constantly hopping on airplanes between different countries?
The depth versus breadth debate.
Yeah, because the whole magic of traditional ethnography is that deep, incredibly nuanced, inside perspective you only get from sustained, uninterrupted immersion in one place. If you were spending a month in Iowa, a month in Mexico, aren't you just skimming the surface? You become a tourist of the community, not an expert.
That is the exact tension that keeps researchers up at night.
Yeah.
The trade-off between breadth and depth is very real. You might sacrifice knowing the intricate daily gossip of a single street corner.
Right.
However, the counter-argument is that studying a hyper-connected community in total geographic isolation produces a scientifically false picture of their reality.
Give me an example of how that happens.
Let's say you spend 5 years deeply studying a small, seemingly isolated rural village. You know every single family. You are deeply immersed.
Okay.
But if you ignore the fact that 40% of the village's income comes from relatives working in Dubai, and that the village's local political decisions are being heavily influenced by a diaspora association in London, your deep, localized immersion is essentially a delusion. You are mistaking the physical location for the entirety of their social world. To understand the local, you have to follow the transnational network that sustains it.
You can't understand the leaf without studying the root system, even if the roots cross a border.
Exactly.
What about historians? Because they have an entirely different struggle. Sociologists can at least buy plane tickets and follow living people. Historians rely on archives, and archives are inherently nationalist.
That is a profound hurdle. State archives are designed to record the business of the state. They record diplomacy between governments, wars, taxes, border crossings.
They records.
But they generally do not record the informal grassroots connections between ordinary people across borders. So if a historian wants to trace the spread of, say, a radical labor ideology in the 1920s among sailors hopping between ports in the Caribbean, South America, and Europe.
There's no single transnational archive to consult.
No. They have to piece together fragments globally. A police report in Havana, a diary entry in London, a union flyer in Buenos Aires.
And this requires a totally different approach to comparison. The text talks about connective versus comparative approaches, because we usually think of comparative history as taking two separate boxes, like, let's compare how immigrants integrated in Germany versus how they integrated in the United States.
But that comparative approach still treats Germany and the U.S. as isolated test tubes. What transnational historians advocate for is a connective approach.
Right, so instead of comparing two isolated boxes, you study the literal flows that link them.
Yes. You might look at how a global shift in agricultural trade policies forced migration that simultaneously impacted rural communities in Germany, industrial centers in the U.S., and ports in North Africa. You focus on the network, the web itself, rather than the spaces between the threads.
And doing that requires piecing together so many fragments, relying heavily on digital humanities to process all that text.
The big data revolution has totally changed the game for studying both the past and the present. We can track the flows with hard numbers now.
Tracking remittance flows, GPS data, digital financial records.
Exactly. We can map the physical reality of transnationalism with incredible precision. We analyze global remittance data to see exactly how billions of dollars flow from wealthy cities to rural villages.
Or using mobile phone pings to trace actual migration routes.
And using complex social network algorithms to map the density of transnational relationships.
But there is a huge trap here, isn't there? A massive blind spot when we rely too heavily on the quantitative methods.
A critical blind spot. Data algorithms can only capture what is visible, formalized, and countable. Data can track a formal money transfer sent through a massive corporation like Western Union. It can track a documented migrant scanning a passport.
But it completely misses the informal networks. It misses the uncle who hand carries $5,000 in cash on a flight to his hometown because the community trusts him more than a bank.
Or it misses the unauthorized migrant crossing a desert totally off the grid.
Right. So if you only look at the data, you risk confusing the visible flow for the entire flow.
The formal economy is only the tip of the iceberg. Therefore, the absolute gold standard in transnational studies is mixed methods.
You need both.
You need the macro-level big data to see the general shape and velocity of the river, but you absolutely must have the qualitative ethnographer on the ground to tell you what the water actually feels like and to map the hidden currents below the surface.
Okay, so we've built the theoretical toolkit. We understand the structural inequalities, the hybridized identities, and the methodological madness. Now, let's bring this down to earth.
The lived reality.
Yes, Section 4. What does transnationalism actually look like in everyday life? How do people physically and mentally live in two worlds at once?
To understand the daily lived experience, sociologists, specifically Peggy Levitt and Nina Glick Schiller, break the transnational social field down into two distinct categories. Ways of being and ways of belonging.
Let's break those down. Ways of being refers to the actual tangible practices, right?
Yes.
The physical actions that connect you across a border.
Yes. So sending a portion of your paycheck back home every month. Traveling back and forth for weddings and funerals.
Participating in hometown associations.
Exactly. Where migrants from a specific village pool their money in their new country to fund a new school or a water well back in their origin village, or even just raising your children to be fiercely bilingual so they can seamlessly navigate both cultures. These are concrete, observable actions.
And then ways of belonging, on the other hand, is the internal landscape. It's about conscious identity.
It's the emotional connection, the nostalgia, the loyalty. It's how you define who we are.
And what's crucial is that these two ways do not always align perfectly, do they?
Not at all. You can imagine a migrant who engages in intensive ways of being. They send money home out of a sense of strict familial duty. They manage property back home, but they feel entirely disconnected emotionally.
Their way of belonging is fully anchored in their new country.
Right. Or conversely, someone might feel an intense, passionate, emotional belonging to a homeland they haven't visited in decades and barely send any money to.
And when you take those intense feelings of belonging and combine them with the capacity to act across borders, things get highly political.
Very quickly.
The source text discusses this extensively, and we're just neutrally presenting the analysis here. But we see phenomena that are entirely reshaping global politics, like what Benedict Anderson calls long-distance nationalism.
This is a profound demonstration of transnational power. Diasporas are not politically inert. Just because a community has physically left a territory does not mean they have surrendered their stake in its political future.
Because they often have access to greater economic resources and political freedoms in their settlement countries, they can exert massive influence back home.
Neutrally speaking, history is full of examples where diaspora communities have literally funded armed conflicts from afar, places like Ireland during the Troubles or Sri Lanka. People living comfortably thousands of miles away can sustain a war financially buying weapons, funding political wings.
But the text also points out that the mechanism works in multiple directions. Diasporas are also frequently the most vital lifeline for democratization movements.
Yes. When an authoritarian regime crushes local opposition, shutting down local newspapers and arresting activists, the diaspora steps in. They use their safe harbor in another country to raise funds, run opposition media outlets, lobby international governments, and provide a protective network.
The political battlefield expands far beyond the nation's physical borders, and it deeply affects the politics of the receiving countries, too.
Oh, massively. Look at the rise of anti-immigrant politics in Europe or North America. Trans migrants are at the absolute center of those fierce debates about national identity, economic anxiety, and what constitutes a liberal democracy.
The containers pushing back against the flow.
And what Transnational Studies tries to do in those debates is provide empirical data. It attempts to shift the focus away from individual blame or cultural panic and instead point to the massive structural forces that guarantee migration will happen regardless of how high a wall is built.
It's all deeply entangled, which leads us to culture. When we talk about cultural flows in global media, there used to be a massive fear. I remember this dominating conversations in the 90s of cultural imperialism.
The idea that American pop culture will brainwash the world.
Right. The assumption was that the sheer economic weight of Hollywood, fast food, American pop music was just going to wash over the globe and erase local traditions, leaving us with a homogenized global monoculture.
That was the dominant framework for a long time. It rightly recognized the massive structural inequality in who controls global media distribution. But it had a fatal flaw.
It assumed audiences around the world were passive sponges, just mindlessly absorbing whatever's broadcast at them.
Exactly. Scholars push past this by introducing a much more dynamic concept from Roland Robertson, globalization.
Global plus local. Globalization.
The premise is that when a global cultural form arrives in a new place, the local population doesn't just swallow it whole, they actively appropriate it. They adapt it, hybridize it, and transform it to articulate their own specific realities.
The global form is localized, and simultaneously, the local reality enters global circuits. The examples the text gives for this are so memorable, especially with music.
Hip-hop is the classic example.
Yeah, hip-hop is a global form unequivocally burrowed in the specific context of Black American communities in the Bronx, but when the form travels, it glocalizes.
In Senegal, youth took the structure of hip-hop and used it to engage deeply with local Senegalese political corruption and social concerns, rapping in local languages.
Or Japanese hip-hop blending languages.
Oh.
Or Palestinian hip-hop, which uses the globally recognizable defiance of the genre to articulate incredibly specific local experiences of occupation, checkpoints, and dispossession.
They aren't just doing an imitation of America, they're taking a globally resonant tool and using it to tell a fiercely local story.
And the digital revolution has supercharged this process by creating pathways that completely bypass the old Western gatekeepers. We have to talk about K-pop or Hallyu.
It completely shatters the cultural imperialism model.
South Korean pop culture didn't conquer the globe by asking permission from Hollywood or relying on major American record labels.
No, they built an entirely different transnational infrastructure. They leveraged digital platforms like YouTube and early social media before Western labels fully understood their power.
And they cultivated these incredibly organized transnational fan armies who did all this unpaid labor translating lyrics, organizing global streaming parties, promoting artists across language barriers.
They combined hyper-local Korean cultural aesthetics and rigorous training systems with global pop structures and pushed it outward. The flow of cultural power reversed, moving massively from east to west.
It's a perfect example of transnational agency, but we can't just talk about culture. We have to follow the money. Let's look at transnational economics.
Beyond remittances, we have to look at how the actual physical goods we consume are made. We have to talk about global commodity chains, a concept heavily developed by Gary Gireffi.
This is how you map the physical reality of the global economy. A commodity chain links the labor conditions of a worker in the global south directly, step by step, to the consumption habits of someone in the global north.
Raw materials are extracted in one nation, shipped to a second nation for initial processing, assembled in a third nation where labor laws are incredibly lax, packaged in a fourth, and sold in a massive retail outlet in a fifth.
Every step crosses a border, seeking the lowest possible cost or the most advantageous regulation. But beyond the massive, faceless multinational corporations, the text looks at the fascinating world of ethnic entrepreneurship.
And this is where traditional economics sometimes struggles to model reality.
Right, because traditional economics models often rely on abstract ideas of rational individuals and formal legal contracts. But transnational studies looks at reality on the ground.
Take the Indian diamond merchants, who historically operated a massive, complex trade between processing centers in Surat, India, and global markets in Antwerp, Belgium, or the sprawling Chinese business networks operating across Southeast Asia.
The burning question is, when you are moving millions of dollars of highly valuable goods across multiple borders, operating in jurisdictions where formal legal systems might be slow, corrupt, or entirely unaligned, how do you enforce a contract? How do you know you won't be robbed?
You don't rely on the courts. You rely on kinship. You use transnational family ties, shared religious affiliations, and deep ethnic community networks to build trust.
The social network literally is the economic infrastructure.
If a merchant in Antwerp cheats a supplier in Surat, the consequence isn't a lawsuit. It's total social and economic excommunication from the entire global network. The social ties reduce transaction costs and guarantee trust in a way that formal legal systems simply cannot match.
It's a shadow infrastructure of trust. And while we're talking about massive economic flows, I have to highlight this mind-blowing fact from the source about the absolute scale of remittances.
It really reframes how we think about global wealth.
It does. Because when most people think about wealth moving from wealthy developed nations to poorer developing nations, they immediately think of foreign aid, UN programs, official development aid, international charity.
It's a very common misconception. The reality of wealth transfer is far more grassroots. Global remittances, the money sent home directly, $20 or $50 at a time, by migrant workers now wildly exceed official development aid.
By a huge margin. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars annually. It is the most direct form of wealth redistribution globally.
It bypasses corrupt state bureaucracies, ignores the red tape of massive NGOs, and goes directly from the hands of the worker in the core city to the family in the peripheral village.
It puts food on tables, builds localized infrastructure, and fundamentally reshapes the economies of entire nations from the bottom up.
So we see how culture moves and how money moves. But if culture and money can bypass borders, so can power. And so can the consequences of our actions. Let's shift our focus to activism and the environment.
How do people mobilize politically across these lines? The source brings up Sidney Terra's concept of transnational contention.
Yes, coordinating political action across national borders. And the classic, most vivid framework to understand how this works is the boomerang pattern of advocacy from Keck and Sikkink in 1998.
The boomerang pattern. Walk us through how that works.
It's a strategic masterpiece of transnational networking. Imagine you have a group of grassroots activists in a country in the global south. Perhaps they're trying to stop a massive environmentally devastating logging project.
Okay.
But their domestic channels for justice are entirely blocked. The local judge is corrupt, the national media is controlled by the state, and protesting locally results in violence. They've hit a brick wall within their own container.
So what do? They can't fight the state head on, so they bypass it, they throw the issue out.
Exactly. They use transnational networks to reach out to international human rights NGOs, environmental groups, and allied activists in wealthy core countries.
And then those international allies take up the cause. They have access to global media. They can pressure international banks to pull funding from the logging project. They can lobby their own powerful governments to place diplomatic sanctions on the oppressive state.
The activists throw their plea outward to the global network, the network amplifies it and aims it at international pressure points, and the pressure boomerangs back onto their own oppressive government from the outside.
It's a brilliant strategic use of the transnational web to bypass local roadblocks. And again, neutrally reporting the text examples here, we see the mechanics of cross-border solidarity constantly.
Look at how the Black Lives Matter movement connected with global struggles against racism. It originated in the U.S. in response to specific local instances, but rapidly transmitted across networks.
It resonated with and inspired struggles in places with entirely different histories, like Brazil, France, and South Africa. The rhetoric, the tactics, the visual symbols, they flew across borders and were globalized to fit local contexts.
Or the incredibly long transnational history of feminism. The movement has always relied on crossing borders to build momentum. From the early 20th century suffragist networks exchanging tactics by mail and ship, to the contemporary instantaneous global circulation of the Me Too movement or international campaigns for reproductive rights.
The solidarity is a flow. But while political movements use networks to cross borders, there is one issue that ignores borders completely, inherently, and by its very physical nature: the environment.
Climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss. The atmosphere does not care about the Westphalian system.
It is the ultimate borderless issue. But here's my question. How does transnational studies look at the environment differently than just standard ecology? Doesn't an ecologist already know the atmosphere has no borders?
An ecologist understands the physical flow of the carbon or the toxin. What transnational studies adds to the equation is the analysis of structural power and flow.
So it doesn't just track the chemical, it maps the political economy of the pollution.
Exactly. It looks at how wealthy countries actively export environmental damage. They don't just pollute their own air, they leverage the inequalities of the world system.
Dumping waste, polluting industries?
Precisely. They locate their most toxic polluting industries in developing countries with weak environmental regulations and desperate needs for foreign investment. They literally load massive cargo ships with hazardous e-waste, old computers, toxic batteries, and dump it in poorer countries.
So transnational studies frames this through the lens of environmental justice. It analyzes the brutal reality that marginalized groups, particularly in the Global South, bear the overwhelming brunt of the burdens from industrial activities they didn't even benefit from.
We have painted a picture of a very dynamic, highly connected, constantly flowing world. We've talked about hybridized identities, strategic activist networks, and massive economic redistribution.
It all sounds very mobilizing. But we have to pause here, Section 6. Isn't there a massive risk of putting rose-colored glasses on all this mobility? If we celebrate the flow, don't we risk ignoring the pain of it?
Yes. And this brings us to the most severe, necessary critiques of the field, the absolute dark side of transnationalism.
Because not everyone is a jet-setting cosmopolitan.
The expert warning from critical scholars is that we must not romanticize mobility. It is very easy for an academic flying to an international conference to present a paper on hybridity to celebrate the borderless world. But for a vast portion of humanity, transnationalism means coercion.
It involves debt bondage to smugglers. It results in terrifying legal precarity, living in the shadows of a global city where you have no labor rights, no civil rights, and constant fear of deportation.
To understand the emotional cost of this, feminist and labor scholars point to a devastating concept coined by Arlie Hochschild, the global care chain.
This concept completely reshaped how I think about the service economy. Walk us through how a global care chain functions.
It describes the transnational extraction of emotional labor. Imagine a wealthy professional household in Los Angeles or London. Both parents work demanding corporate jobs, so they need full-time care for their children. To meet this demand, a woman migrates from a poorer country, perhaps the Philippines or El Salvador, to work as their nanny.
But she has children of her own back home.
Exactly. To care for the children in the wealthy core country, she must leave her own children behind in the periphery. So she uses a portion of her wages to hire another woman, perhaps migrating from an even poorer rural province, to care for her children.
It creates a domino effect.
It is a literal chain of emotional labor and care extractions stretching across the globe. The core doesn't just extract copper or coffee from the periphery. It extracts love, care, and family time, structured by massive, cruel inequalities of race, class, and global geography.
That completely punctures the romantic view of the borderless world. It's a flow of trauma. But beyond the human cost, there is another major structural critique of the field. And I have to admit, I share this pushback.
Inverting methodological nationalism.
Yeah, if everything is transnational, if everything is flowing and bypassing the state, don't we risk forgetting that governments still have armies? They write laws that can throw you in solitary confinement. They are physically pouring concrete to build border walls. The nation-state clearly hasn't disappeared.
The critique is incredibly valid. The concern is that transnational studies sometimes overcorrects. In its eagerness to tear down the bento box, it merely inverts the error. It treats the transnational flow as the only reality, treating the state as a relic.
But the most robust transnational scholarship fully accepts this pushback, right? The wall and the flow are not mutually exclusive.
They are mutually constituting.
What does mutually constituting mean in practical terms?
It means they create and react to each other continuously. Nations respond to flows by militarizing borders or subsidizing local culture. You can't understand the flow without understanding the wall it hits.
The wall creates the conditions for the transnational smuggler network to become more sophisticated and more dangerous. And the state often uses the perceived threat of the flow to justify massive expansion of its own surveillance. They're locked in a continuous dance.
There is one more major critique we must address regarding race and the long shadow of empire. This comes from decolonial theorists like Quijano and Mignolo.
You point out the coloniality of power.
Their argument is stark. If transnational studies talks abstractly about flows and networks, but ignores the deep historical racial ordering of the world, it fails completely.
To really understand this, the text gives a crucial analogy. Contrast two simultaneous movements across the exact same body of water, the Mediterranean Sea.
On one hand, you have a European tourist crossing the Mediterranean from Spain to Morocco on a comfortable ferry, perhaps for a weekend holiday.
On the other hand, you have an African migrant attempting the exact same geographic crossing from North Africa to Europe on an overcrowded, dangerous rubber dinghy.
The geographic movement is identical, but the experience, the legality, and the risk of death are fundamentally vastly different. And the difference isn't just a piece of paper, a passport.
It's a deep historical racial ordering of human worth and mobility established during colonialism.
Yes. The coloniality of power dictates who is assumed to be a legitimate traveler deserving of safe passage and who is criminalized, detained, or literally left to drown. If the field ignores this epistemic hierarchy, it fails.
Mobility is a privilege distributed by history, which leads us to look forward to our final section. As we peer over the horizon, how are the new massive forces of our era, technology and climate change, going to rewrite the rules of this transnational reality?
Let's talk about the digital reality first. Digital transnationalism. The internet has obviously created real-time digital diasporas. You can maintain your cultural identity and organize across the globe instantaneously.
But tech is a massive double-edged sword. While activists use it, states utilize that exact same digital infrastructure for unprecedented border surveillance. The border is no longer just a physical line in the sand. It is a digital net cast across the globe.
And we must look at the corporations that own the net. They use digital platforms to extract unbelievable value from transnational communities while dodging local taxes.
And it relies on invisible transnational digital labor. There are workers in developing nations annotating AI training data or doing deeply traumatic content moderation for Silicon Valley companies, filtering out the worst violence so our feeds stay clean.
And they are paid a tiny fraction of the wages. The physical factory floor has moved into the digital cloud, but the brutal inequalities remain completely identical.
The extraction just got faster. And finally, as we look to the future, we have to return to the climate. Climate change is the ultimate transnational force.
Environmental displacement is going to dwarf any historical migration patterns we have ever studied. The current nation-state system, the bento box, is entirely unequipped to handle it.
The central political and ethical challenge of our era is going to be international climate cooperation and distributional conflicts. Who pays for adaptation?
Exactly. Who pays for the massive seawalls when the vast majority of the atmospheric carbon was emitted by industrialization in the core countries? Relying on isolated national interests will mean catastrophe.
So after this massive journey, What is the core takeaway from tearing down the bento box? For me, it's the realization that transnational studies isn't about ignoring the nation state. It's a vital corrective lens.
It helps us understand why the world is organized the way it is, whose interests it serves, and what alternatives might exist.
And the ethical implication here is huge.
It is. We live in a world structured by massive inequalities where money moves instantly, but humans are detained. In that reality, refusing to take borders for granted is an ethical choice.
We have to look past the container. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own today. Think about your own day today. From the coffee you drank, to the digital labor that keeps your social media feed clean, to the atmospheric carbon generated by your commute.
Tracing the threads.
You are already a transnational subject. The question is, now that you can see the invisible threads connecting you to the rest of the globe, how will you choose to pull on them?
It changes everything once you see the reality beneath the map.
The bold lines are just ink. The bento box is broken. The flavors have always been mixed.